Naomi! She didn't answer. A silver serving tray crashed onto the marble floor, its sharp echo cutting through the mansion. Another maid dropped to her knees beside her. "Call an ambulance." Someone fumbled for a phone. Someone else began crying. After nearly 48 hours of covering impossible shifts, the exhausted plus-size senior maid lay motionless, her breathing barely visible. No one knew what to do. Then, a calm voice sliced through the panic. "Move!" Every servant stepped aside without hesitation. Every bodyguard lowered his head. The master of the Marino estate walked straight toward her, ignoring the expensive tuxedo waiting for the charity banquet. He lifted Naomi gently into his arms. A senior bodyguard hurried forward. "Sir, I'll carry her." Luca Marino never slowed. "No." "She collapsed serving my family. I'll carry her." The entire mansion fell silent. No one had ever seen Chicago's most feared mafia boss hold anyone with such unmistakable care. The private emergency entrance of St. Gabriel Medical Center had never seen so many black luxury SUVs arrive at once. Doctors and nurses exchanged startled glances as security personnel quietly secured the hallway without creating unnecessary panic. They all recognized the man walking through the sliding doors, Luca Marino, the billionaire chairman whose charitable donations had funded an entire pediatric wing. Few knew the truth behind his composed expression. Fewer still realized that every physician in the hospital understood one unspoken rule. If Luca Marino personally carried someone into the emergency room, that person's life instantly became the hospital's highest priority. "She's severely dehydrated," one emergency physician said while directing the trauma team. "Blood pressure is dangerously low. Pulse is unstable. Prepare IV fluids immediately." Naomi never regained consciousness. Even after the nurses gently placed her onto the hospital bed, her fingers remained loosely curled, evidence that her body no longer possessed the strength to relax. Luca stood silently near the doorway. He neither interrupted nor asked unnecessary questions. He simply watched. For years, he had witnessed men survive gunshot wounds without changing expression. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions while competitors tried to intimidate him. He had spent most of his adult life believing every crisis could be solved through discipline, calculation, and control. Yet nothing had prepared him for the helpless feeling of watching one exhausted woman struggle simply to breathe. Nearly an hour later, the attending physician stepped outside. "Mr. Marino?" Luca looked up immediately. "Will she recover?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, but only because she collapsed when she did." Luca remained silent. The physician continued carefully. "Another 12, perhaps 24 hours of this workload." He paused. "I'm not sure her body could have survived it." For the first time in years, Luca felt genuine fear. Not the fear of losing money, not the fear of betrayal, not even the fear that followed dangerous negotiations. This was different. It was the quiet terror that arrives when someone who had always seemed dependable suddenly becomes frighteningly fragile. Inside the room, machines monitored Naomi's heartbeat with steady electronic rhythm. Outside, Luca removed his phone. His executive assistant answered before the second ring. "Cancel today's board meeting." "Yes, sir." "And tomorrow's." A brief silence followed. "The European investors have already—" "They can wait." The charity banquet rehearsal? Cancelled. The press conference? Cancelled. Every appointment that had filled months of planning disappeared within 60 seconds. No one argued. No one questioned his decision. His next call went to the head of household operations. "I want every staff schedule from the past 6 months. Every overtime record. Every shift exchange." The manager swallowed audibly. "Immediately, sir." Luca's voice remained calm. Too calm. And one more thing. Yes, sir? I want to know why my senior maid believed collapsing was easier than asking for help. The line fell completely silent, because no one had an answer. Hours passed. Evening settled over Chicago. Luca refused to leave. A nurse quietly entered to replace Naomi's IV bag. She hesitated before speaking. Mr. Marino, you've been standing here all afternoon. We can call you if anything changes. His eyes never left Naomi. I'll stay. The nurse smiled gently. She must be very important to you. For a long moment, Luca said nothing. He searched for an explanation that made sense. Employer, employee, responsibility, duty. None of those words felt honest anymore. Finally, he answered with quiet certainty. She spent years taking care of everyone else. It's my turn. Outside the hospital room, members of the Marino household waited in uneasy silence. Inside the mansion, whispers spread through every hallway. The feared head of the Marino family had cancelled his entire schedule. Not for a political leader, not for a billionaire investor, not for an emergency involving his empire, but for one exhausted maid who had worked herself almost to death serving his family. By sunrise, every timesheet from the Marino estate covered the long conference table inside Luca's private office. The household director stood rigidly across from him. So did the human resources supervisor. Vanessa Holt. No one dared speak first. Luca slowly turned another page, then another. The overtime records made no sense. Naomi Parker had worked nearly every weekend for the past 3 years. She had accepted double shifts, night shifts, holiday shifts, emergency replacements. On paper, it appeared impossible for one employee to remain standing. Yet somehow, she always had. Explain. Luca's quiet voice carried more weight than shouting ever could. The household director cleared his throat. Technically, none of these hours were assigned directly. Luca looked up. They were volunteered. Vanessa quickly added, Naomi always insisted. She liked staying busy. No one else spoke. Luca noticed it immediately. People were avoiding eye contact. They're afraid, he observed. The room became even quieter. Finally, an elderly butler named Arthur sighed. Sir, if I may. Luca gave a slight nod. Arthur folded his hands behind his back. Naomi never volunteered because she enjoyed working. She volunteered because none of us knew how to say no when someone needed help. Another housekeeper wiped tears from her eyes. If my son had a school recital, Naomi covered my shift. A young gardener spoke next. When my wife gave birth, she worked 16 hours so I could stay at the hospital. The pastry chef smiled sadly. When I burned my arm last winter, she prepared breakfast for the entire estate before starting her own duties. One memory after another filled the room. Not dramatic sacrifices, small kindnesses, repeated thousands of times, the kind that slowly become invisible because everyone begins expecting them. Then Arthur chuckled softly. There was another habit. Luca raised an eyebrow. Arthur smiled. Every morning around 6. We'd find a fresh breakfast outside your office. Luca frowned slightly. I assumed Chef Marco prepared it. The chef laughed. I wish I could take credit. It was Naomi. Luca stared at him. Every day. For almost a year. Another maid couldn't help smiling. She always complained that you skipped breakfast. A security guard added with a grin. She even made little notes. He reached into his pocket before remembering he no longer had them. They usually said things like, "Coffee isn't breakfast. Drink water today. Please sleep before midnight for once." Even Arthur laughed. The amazing part wasn't the notes. It was your reaction. Luca looked genuinely confused. My reaction? You listened? The room erupted into quiet laughter. The tension eased for the first time all day. The chef nodded enthusiastically. If Naomi left fruit, you ate fruit. If she replaced coffee with tea, you drank tea. If she wrote, "One sandwich isn't enough," you finished every bite. Luca blinked. I never thought about it. Arthur smiled knowingly. Exactly. You obeyed without realizing who you were obeying. For a man whose orders influenced corporations, politicians, and powerful men across Chicago, it was somehow a senior maid who quietly changed his daily habits. No arguments, no negotiations, just gentle reminders written on folded pieces of paper. The laughter faded as another folder reached Luca's hands. Medical reimbursement requests. He opened the first document. Stroke rehabilitation, physical therapy, speech therapy, weekly transportation, patient, Richard Parker, relationship, father. Luca continued reading. Every extra dollar Naomi earned disappeared into medical bills. There were no luxury purchases, no vacations, no expensive clothes, only invoices from hospitals, medication, rehabilitation equipment, months, then years. Page after page told the same story. She had been working herself beyond exhaustion simply to give her father another chance to walk again. Then another document appeared. Not financial, personal. A resignation letter from 5 years earlier, unsigned. Attached was an incident report. Luca read silently. An employee had overheard Naomi's fiancé ending their engagement. His reason was brutally simple. I can't spend my life pretending I don't care what people think. They'll laugh when they see us together. You'd be beautiful if you weren't so big. The words sat heavily in the room. No one moved. No one breathed loudly enough to disturb the silence. Luca closed the folder carefully. He thought about every morning Naomi had smiled while serving breakfast, every joke she made to encourage nervous new employees, every time she reminded him to eat without asking for anything in return. Behind every smile, she had been carrying debts, grief, humiliation, loneliness, and somehow she had still found enough kindness to care for everyone else. For the first time in many years, Luca Marino understood something no balance sheet, board meeting, or criminal empire had ever taught him. The strongest person inside his mansion had also been the one suffering alone. He rose from his chair. Prepare a full report on Vanessa Holt's management practices. His voice remained calm, but everyone recognized the decision had already been made. Then he looked toward the hospital, visible through the office window. Quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "No one will make her carry this alone again." Morning sunlight filtered softly through the hospital curtains, painting pale golden lines across the quiet room. The frantic urgency of the previous day had disappeared. Only the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor disturbed the silence. Naomi lay peacefully beneath a light blanket, her complexion no longer frighteningly pale. The IV continued delivering fluids that her exhausted body desperately needed. Beside her bed, someone remained seated. Luca Marino had finally accepted a chair after nearly an entire night of refusing to leave. His jacket rested neatly across the back of another chair. The sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled to his forearms. Several untouched cups of coffee had long since gone cold on the table beside him. Ironically, The woman who had spent months reminding him not to live on coffee alone had unknowingly prevented him from drinking a single cup since she collapsed. He was reading another medical report when he felt the slightest movement. Naomi's fingers twitched. A nurse standing outside noticed immediately. "Mr. Marino, I think she's waking up." Luca quietly stood. Naomi's eyelashes fluttered. The bright hospital lights blurred into unfamiliar shapes before slowly coming into focus. Everything felt heavy. Her arms, her head, even breathing required effort. She frowned slightly, trying to remember what had happened. The banquet, the kitchen, the trays, someone asking if another shift could be covered. Then nothing. Instinctively, she searched for something steady, something reassuring. Without fully opening her eyes, her hand reached weakly across the blanket. Warm fingers met hers. She wrapped her hand around them without thinking. The touch felt calm, safe, grounding. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Luca looked down at their joined hands. He made no attempt to pull away. Instead, his thumb gently rested against the back of hers, allowing her to hold on as tightly or as loosely as she needed. When Naomi's vision finally cleared, she turned toward the person beside her. Recognition came instantly. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Marino?" She looked down. Only then did she realize whose hand she was holding. A deep blush spread across her cheeks. "Oh, I'm so sorry." She released him immediately, trying to push herself upright. The sudden movement made the room spin violently. Luca stepped forward before she could lose her balance. "Easy." His voice was low. "Calm." "The doctor said you shouldn't sit up too quickly." Naomi froze. Instead of asking why she was in the hospital, instead of asking how long she had been unconscious, her first words were exactly what Luca expected. "I'm sorry. My shift, the banquet. I didn't finish preparing the—" "Naomi." She stopped speaking. For the first time since she had opened her eyes, Luca looked directly into hers. "You apologized for collapsing." He paused just long enough for the words to settle. "Before asking how you were." The room became impossibly still. "That tells me everything I need to know." Naomi lowered her gaze. "I caused everyone trouble." "No," his answer came immediately. "You worked until your body failed." "Those are not the same thing." Her eyes shimmered. Nobody had ever corrected her like that before. For years, she had measured her worth by how useful she could be. If she rested, she felt guilty. If she accepted help, she felt selfish. If she disappointed someone, she apologized before they could complain. Luca seemed to understand all of that, without her explaining a single word. She tried to laugh softly. "I guess I wasn't as strong as I thought." He shook his head. "That's where you're wrong." She looked at him, puzzled. The strongest people usually collapse in silence. They spend so long carrying everyone else. They forget they're allowed to become tired. A tear escaped before Naomi could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry." This time, Luca almost smiled. "There you go again." Another apology. She laughed through her tears, a quiet, genuine laugh that neither of them had expected. Outside the room, Olivia Marino had arrived only moments earlier. Through the tall glass window, she watched the conversation unfold. She noticed something her son had not. Since Naomi opened her eyes, Luca had not once looked at his phone, not once asked about the cancelled meetings, not once mentioned business. His entire attention remained fixed on the woman sitting in the hospital bed. Olivia smiled to herself. For years, she had wondered whether her emotionally guarded son was capable of letting someone into his carefully controlled world. Now she had her answer. He already had. He simply hadn't realized it yet. Inside the room, Naomi looked down at her hands. Without thinking, she remembered how warm his hand had felt when she reached for it. She wasn't certain why, but for the first time in many years, the hospital room no longer felt lonely. 3 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Marino Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Chicago's most influential business leaders, philanthropists, politicians, and media personalities gathered beneath the historic ceiling, celebrating another record-breaking fundraising gala. The evening marked Naomi's first appearance since leaving the hospital. She almost hadn't come. Only after Olivia Marino personally visited her apartment had she reluctantly agreed. "You've spent years helping everyone celebrate," Olivia had told her warmly. "Tonight, let someone celebrate you." Even so, Naomi felt painfully out of place. Her navy blue evening gown was elegant, but simple. Unlike the designer dresses surrounding her, it carried no famous label. She quietly reminded herself she was only there because Olivia had insisted. She planned to congratulate the organizers, thank everyone for their kindness, and leave before attracting attention. Unfortunately, someone else had different plans. Vanessa Holt noticed Naomi the moment she entered the ballroom. Dismissal proceedings against Vanessa had already begun after Luca's investigation, but until the board finalized its decision, she technically remained operations manager. Humiliation had slowly turned into resentment, and resentment needed someone to blame. She crossed the ballroom with a polished smile that never reached her eyes. "My goodness!" Her voice carried just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "The miracle maid has returned." Several conversations paused. Naomi offered a polite smile. "Good evening, Ms. Holt." Vanessa ignored the greeting. "I suppose collapsing at exactly the right moment has its advantages." A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed nearby. Naomi frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "Oh, come now." Vanessa folded her arms. "You disappear for a few weeks. Suddenly everyone treats you like some kind of heroine." She tilted her head dramatically. "It almost makes people wonder whether you exaggerated the whole thing." The surrounding guests exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi's face lost its color. "I wasn't pretending." Vanessa laughed softly. "Really? You looked perfectly healthy every day before that. Then suddenly the chairman cancels his schedule, carries you himself, and now you're attending charity galas. What remarkable timing." The whispers grew louder. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her. The old familiar feeling returned, the feeling of being judged before anyone bothered learning the truth. She instinctively lowered her gaze. "I never wanted attention." Vanessa stepped closer. "No." "Then perhaps you should stop acting like the victim." Olivia Marino had already begun moving across the ballroom. Several board members followed. Before they could intervene, Vanessa deliberately brushed hard against Naomi's shoulder. The movement looked almost accidental. Almost. Naomi had only recently regained her strength. The unexpected shove threw her off balance. Her heels slipped across the polished marble floor. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. She closed her eyes, expecting another painful fall. Instead, a strong arm caught her around the waist before she reached the ground. Another hand steadied her shoulder with surprising gentleness. She opened her eyes. Luca. He had crossed half the ballroom in only seconds. For one brief moment, he looked only at Naomi. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." His expression softened. "Good." Only then did he slowly turn toward Vanessa. The warmth disappeared from his face. Silence spread naturally through the ballroom. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Luca spoke calmly. "So, you believe Miss Parker pretended to collapse?" Vanessa forced an uneasy smile. "I only meant, no." His voice remained composed. "You've already said enough." He turned slightly, addressing every guest in the room. 3 weeks ago, this woman worked nearly 48 consecutive hours because she believed serving others mattered more than resting herself. No one moved. The emergency physicians informed me that another single day of that workload— He paused. "I might have killed her." The words struck the ballroom like thunder. Several guests looked toward Naomi with visible shock. Others lowered their heads. Luca continued. "While many people in this room were preparing speeches for this evening, she was quietly covering other employees' shifts. While others enjoyed time with their families, she was earning extra wages to pay for her father's stroke rehabilitation." His gaze settled once more on Vanessa. "You call that manipulation. I call it sacrifice." Vanessa's confidence disappeared. I didn't know," Luca answered without raising his voice. "You never asked." The silence became almost unbearable. Finally, Luca extended his hand toward Naomi. Not as an employer, not as a chairman, simply as a man asking someone he deeply respected to stand beside him. After a brief hesitation, she placed her hand in his. He helped her stand fully upright, without letting go. Then he faced the audience one final time. "From this evening forward, no employee serving the Marino family will ever be shamed for becoming exhausted while caring for others. And no one," his eyes briefly met Vanessa's, "will ever mistake kindness for weakness again." The ballroom erupted into applause, not polite applause, grateful applause. Many guests stood. Some wiped away tears. Naomi looked around in stunned disbelief. For the first time in her life, someone hadn't merely defended her. Someone had publicly declared that her kindness had value. And somehow, the man holding her hand looked even prouder than she felt. The fallout from the charity banquet spread through Marino Holdings before sunrise. By the following morning, every executive had received an official memorandum from the chairman's office. One announcement drew everyone's attention. Vanessa Holt's employment had been terminated effective immediately. The internal review left little room for debate. It documented years of excessive workloads, ignored staff welfare, and repeated misuse of Naomi's willingness to help others. Although Naomi had technically volunteered for every extra shift, Vanessa had knowingly exploited that generosity instead of protecting it. When security escorted Vanessa from headquarters, she glanced back only once. For the first time since joining the company, she realized something she had never understood. A business could replace talent. It could recover lost money. But once kindness disappeared from a workplace, it was almost impossible to bring back. Meanwhile, Luca's investigation did not end with a dismissal. It became the beginning of something much larger. Within 2 weeks, Marino Holdings announced the most comprehensive employee well-being initiative in company history. Mandatory limits on overtime, mental health counseling, paid caregiver leave, emergency financial assistance, quarterly wellness examinations, anonymous reporting systems for workplace abuse. Managers would now be evaluated not only by profits, but also by employee well-being. Executives privately admitted they had never seen Luca personally review so many human resources policies. Every proposal returned, covered with handwritten notes. Reduce maximum consecutive shifts. No employee should fear requesting medical leave. Supervisors are responsible for noticing exhaustion before employees stop functioning. The board quietly understood the truth. None of these policies had begun inside a conference room. They had begun beside a hospital bed. Several weeks later, Naomi returned to the Marino estate. This time, her schedule contained strict limits, personally approved by Luca himself. She protested almost immediately. "Mr. Marino, I'm perfectly capable of working full days again." Luca looked up from the documents on his desk. "I know." She blinked. "But the schedule isn't negotiable." She sighed with playful frustration. "I've never had a boss who insisted I work less. I've never had an employee who believed collapsing counted as productivity." She couldn't help laughing. "You remembered." "I remember everything you choose to forget." The words lingered between them. Naomi lowered her eyes, feeling an unfamiliar warmth rise to her cheeks. Their conversations gradually became easier. Sometimes they shared breakfast together before his meetings. Sometimes they walked through the mansion gardens after dinner, while Olivia conveniently found reasons to stay inside. Neither acknowledged what everyone else had already noticed. The distance between employer and employee had quietly disappeared. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline, Luca found Naomi replacing fresh white lilies beneath the portrait of his late grandmother, just as she had done every Sunday for years. She carefully adjusted one flower before speaking without turning around. She must have been very special. Luca nodded. "She taught me that power means very little if people are afraid to tell you the truth." Naomi smiled softly. "I think she'd be proud of you." He looked at her. "I'm still learning." She laughed quietly. "We all are." For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable, not empty, simply shared. Finally, Naomi took a slow breath. "There is something I've never understood." Luca waited patiently. "Why me?" She turned toward him. "There are women far more beautiful, more sophisticated. They belong in your world." She hesitated. "I clean that world." Her voice remained calm, but years of quiet insecurity lived beneath every word. "I spent most of my life believing dependable women are appreciated." She forced a small smile. "But never chosen." Luca stepped closer. Not enough to overwhelm her, just enough that she no longer felt alone. "Naomi," she looked into his eyes. "I didn't fall in love because you were strong." Her breathing caught. He continued gently. "I fell in love because you kept carrying everyone else." He paused, "until your own heart had nothing left." A single tear escaped down her cheek. He reached out slowly. Not to wipe it away, simply to give her the choice. She closed the small distance herself. His fingertips brushed her face with extraordinary care. "You reminded me to eat. You reminded me to sleep. You remembered my grandmother. You treated me like a man. Long before you knew what I truly was." His voice grew quieter. "The whole world respected my power. You cared whether I had breakfast." Naomi laughed through her tears. "I thought someone had to." "I'm very glad someone did." For the first time in years, she no longer saw Chicago's most feared mafia boss standing before her. She saw only the lonely man who had spent an entire night beside her hospital bed because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Slowly, she slipped her hand into his. This time, neither of them needed an excuse. 6 months later, Marino Holdings no longer looked like the company it had once been. Across dozens of offices throughout Chicago, quiet but meaningful changes had become part of everyday life. Employees no longer felt guilty for taking medical leave. Managers checked on exhausted staff before assigning additional work. Break rooms stayed full, counselors remained available. Overtime became the exception instead of the expectation. Productivity increased. Staff turnover fell dramatically. Even industry analysts struggled to explain how a corporation had become more profitable after asking its people to work less. Those inside the company already knew the answer. People worked hardest when they felt valued. Standing at the center of those changes was a woman who had once believed her only worth came from saying yes. Naomi Parker now served as Director of Employee Well-Being for Merino Holdings. The title had surprised almost everyone outside the company. Inside the organization, however, no one questioned the appointment. There was no one more qualified to recognize silent exhaustion than the woman who had nearly lost her life because nobody recognized hers. On the afternoon of the Foundation's annual impact report, journalists gathered inside the renovated conference hall. The event celebrated not financial achievements, but people. Employees shared stories about receiving support during illnesses. Parents spoke about spending time with newborn children instead of fearing lost wages. One longtime groundskeeper smiled as he described finally attending his daughter's graduation after 23 years of missing family milestones. Naomi listened from the front row, her eyes quietly filling with tears. Every story reminded her that the worst week of her life had become the beginning of something that would protect thousands of others. During the question and answer session, one reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Merino?" Luca nodded politely. "You entrusted a former maid with leading employee well-being across one of Chicago's largest companies. What convinced you she was the right person?" The room fell silent. Every camera turned toward him. Luca glanced briefly toward Naomi before answering. His expression softened in the familiar way only she seemed able to inspire. "Because she taught me something my empire never could." He paused. "The strongest people are usually the ones who never ask for help." The room remained silent for several seconds before applause slowly began. It spread from one table to another until every guest was standing. Naomi lowered her head, overwhelmed. She had spent years believing that kindness disappeared unnoticed. Now an entire room stood because of it. As the applause gradually faded, Luca walked away from the podium. Not toward executives, not toward politicians, not toward photographers. He walked directly to Naomi. Without speaking, she looked up at him. The same quiet understanding passed between them that had begun months earlier inside a hospital room. Only this time, neither of them hesitated. Naomi slipped her hand into his. Luca gently closed his fingers around hers. There was no urgency, no fear, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty. A photographer captured the moment. The billionaire, the former maid. Two hands held together without embarrassment, without apology, without letting go. Later that evening, as they stood overlooking the Chicago skyline from the mansion balcony, Naomi rested her head lightly against Luca's shoulder. "I used to think being dependable meant carrying everything alone." Luca intertwined his fingers with hers. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I know real strength is letting someone carry the weight with you." He kissed her forehead gently. "Then we'll carry it together." Below them, the lights of Chicago stretched endlessly into the night. For the first time in both their lives, neither of them was carrying the world alone.